Hello and welcome to New Wave Global. You are watching Unraveled and I'm your host, Marvi Sarmad. The picturesque valley of Kurram district, particularly Parachinar, has become the epicenter of some of the deadliest violence in recent times. Over 100 lives have been lost, as per a report in the news and other local media organizations. Countless families have been displaced, and an uneasy ceasefire is hanging by a thread. This is not just a tale of a sectarian clash, but one of a deep rooted systemic failure to protect citizens from hate, conflict, and bloodshed. The story of Kurram is one of centuries old coexistence being torn apart by rising violence and intolerance, weaponized sectarianism, and a crisis of governance. But tonight, we aim to go beyond the headlines. What are the underlying forces driving this conflict? And is there a way forward for the people of Parachanar? To help us unpack these complex questions, we are joined by an eminent voice from the region. My guest tonight is Iftikhar Firdaus, an experienced journalist and the founder and editor of the Khurasan Diary. Thank you very much, Iftikhar, and welcome for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure, Mavi, and seeing you after a very long time. It's an immense pleasure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a pleasure seeing you. So, Iftikhar, let's begin by understanding the gravity of the situation. You have been covering Kurram and its complexities for years. What do you make of the last few weeks, and why has the violence reached such catastrophic proportions now?
So, just to update in terms of casualty numbers and the extent of damage that has taken place, today there was because our province is governed by the PTI,
Mm.
and so they were busy in the Dharna and everything else in Islamabad. But today, since the chief minister was in KP, he was given a security brief. Statistics have been scant in terms of what the actual damages are. We
Mm.
didn't know to the extent of what these areas have suffered in the recent couple of days, actually.
Mm.
And despite the fact that a ceasefire was announced. So today it's been officially confirmed that there have been 111 deaths and about more than 88 injured that are still at hospital. If you move and count in the total injuries, they surpass over 300 people. As far as the displacements are concerned, we were talking of huge swaths of land that have seen displacement. And if I have to put a number, there are only estimates for it right now, but roughly between 6 to 10,000 individuals that have been displaced because of the ongoing conflict. So it actually shows the extent of damage that has taken place. But why is this happening is the question that everybody keeps asking.
Mm.
Conflict to Kurram is nothing new, and there are periods of lull, and then we see a certain oscillation of violence, and then
Mm.
tribes come together, and they rejoin and reconcile, and then we see another patch of, a peaceful few weeks, and then there is another incident that takes place.
Mm.
As you said, and you pointed out correctly, it's the systemic problem which actually the genesis of it is from governance issues, long-standing governance issues since pre-partition, actually. Because the first clashes in Kurram are reported in 1943, and they're part of the British Gazetteer's records that all of this was in relation to specific land disputes. And then
Mhm.
we saw an instigation in the 1960s, but the actual crux of it starts during the Zia era.
Yeah,
Uh,
1980s. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we see that uh, some of the internal forces to Pakistan trying to counter the influence of the Iranian Revolution.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's my actually next question, and I'm glad you are already moving towards that direction. Would it be reductive to call it just a, because in Pakistan, I have heard many media organizations, many journalists who are covering this issue, calling it a property feud. Would it be reductive to call it just a property feud or just a sectarian, riots, whether they are geopolitical and economic factors at play, you were saying?
I think it's a severe reduction to reduce the conflict, not just to sectarianism or just a land dispute.
Mm,
There are several factors. And since I was writing a research paper, because people have been calling me to sort of explain in terms of actually what's happening.
mm,
So I was studying the traditional, view, the way that the state has been viewing Kurram and how it's been trying to solve its problems and why do they remain unsolved. So there are five different factors that actually influence Kurram. The first is basically its tri-district boundary with Afghanistan.
mm,
It actually is with three different provinces of Afghanistan. There's part
mm.
of Nangarhar, Paktiya, and Paktika, all very tumultuous zones from Afghanistan that are.
2 PK they call it.
Pardon?
2 PK they call it. Bhakti,
Yes, exactly.
Pika,
Yes,
and
yes, yes, yes. So, I mean, that is the larger problem that has existed. And the way that Kurram has been viewed through that lens is primarily the war in Afghanistan. So that's
mm,
one aspect of it. The
mm,
second aspect of it is the local tribal grievances, which has a tinge of sectarianism attached to it. That's between the Shia and Sunni tribes. My academic friends actually dispute the term. They say that there is no such thing as Shia and Sunni tribes because prior to Zia's era, they were intermarriages, and half of the tribe is Sunni and half of the tribe is Shia. So there are no such thing as Shia and Sunni tribes. They are sects that are Shia and Sunni. So never use the term. They say that it's politically incorrect to call it Shia and Sunni tribes. But that differences in terms of sectarian tribal ethnicities does exist. So that's the second part of the
mm,
architectural mosaic of Kurram. The third part of it is actually the proxy war zone as it was used for. And they've been, I remember going to Kurram in 2007 and then back in 2009. And there were certain elements that were supported by Iran, and then there were certain elements that were supported by the Saudi Arabian and the Gulf states. Um, and
mm,
it the wall chalkings and the way that the cities were framed actually spoke about who was who at that particular time. And this
mm,
was when the military operations in the areas had not just yet begun, and everything was in a pretty raw form, so it was very evident. So
mm,
the international proxy war zone effect is the third part of Kurram.
mm,
And then, the fourth part of it is actually the sectarian angle on which we call local sectarian politics. These are between local groups, um, and there can be several names that have been, they get banned and then they rebrand themselves. So you can, the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, the Sipahi Muhammad, then there was the Sapa Sahaba, and
mm,
it was, now it is the Ahl Sunnat wal Jamaat as they call it. And then there have been the Zainabiyun brigades and the Fatmiyun brigades
yeah.
from the other side. So then the more localized sectarian phenomena that has international roots. And then the fifth part of it is actually the mainstream terror organizations, as we call terrorists. And these are five ways in which, the conflict of Kurram is instigated. And the land dispute is considered to be part of the more tribal dispute rather than more sectarian dispute, traditionally looking at Kurram. Now, over the years, what's happened is the way that the conflict has evolved is very different from what we saw in the early 2000s
Mhm,
because it was the shortest route into host. So the Haqqanis enjoyed a tremendous amount of influence in Kurram district,
mm,
and they were actually guarantors, and they were part of the larger jirgas that were
mm,
being held. Two important events in Kurram, if they
mm,
had been implemented properly,
mm,
they would have guaranteed peace in one way. One was the Murray Accord, which was
mm,
being pushed by Nawaz Sharif.
mm.
The second part of it was the
This is
Haqqani-led.
post 2017, probably.
This is in 2014, if I remember
14.
exactly,
Oh,
13, 14,
yeah.
yeah.
Mm,
And then the Haqqani-led process as well. And this we are talking when the road had been closed for like 3 years, and
yeah.
people from Kurram had to move into Afghanistan. And this is the time where we actually saw uh, a drastic population movement, from Kurram towards Europe as well as Australia. And so for every second week, I remember at that time reporting on the issue, there would be a boat capsizing somewhere on the coast of Australia or in Europe. And we
Mm.
would realize that 80 people, 90 people from Kurram have drowned and died because of that. So,
And
and I,
also for the people who are for our viewers who are not familiar with the area, can you confirm, Iftikhar, that this is the same road which is probably the only land route to the rest of Pakistan from Parachinar?
yeah, so though you, I mean, within Pakistan, from Padachinar, you have to cross through, the single road, which is known as the Tal Sada Padachinar
Yeah.
Highway, which is around about roughly 60 to 62 kilometers in its length. And this conflict is entire on the side of this one highway.
Mm.
Because Upper Kurram is primarily Shia dominated population.
Mm.
Lower Kurram is Sada, which is Sunni dominated.
So many dominated, yeah.
And Lower Kurram, which is Alizai, is basically a mixture of both, but it has a predominant Sunni population. But
Mm.
you see a tinge of what it would have been when intermarriages take place when you move to Lower Kurram, because people somehow are more tolerant. But
Mm.
unfortunately, this incident that recently took place also took place in Lower Kurram. Now, uh, how what actually instigated these factors is a couple of things. I
Mm.
think one of the major marker of it is the war in Syria and Iraq. That is something post 2014
Mm.
that we that several people, not just from the Shia side, but also from the Sunni side.
Mm.
The Sunnis went and joined the Islamic State,
Yeah.
whereas Shias went and joined Bashar
Same.
al-Assad,
Yeah.
and yeah, and that's where the Zainabiyun arose from.
Mm.
Um, And then, I mean, after the Iraq and Syria issues had settled down till some extent, and Bashar al-Assad's forces, they controlled some sort of an area. Reports actually started coming in much earlier. I remember in 2015 till 2020, even, there was a huge proxy warfare, and every time there would be an attack, a drone attack by the Turks or some other country that was fighting in Syria, because that conflict was so complicated and so interwoven with each other that names would be published as obituaries by the Zenebiyun, and they would be mostly from this part of the world. So the Fatmiyun brigade was primarily functional in Afghanistan, whereas the Zenebiyun was the part that
Mm.
actually took people from Pakistan. And Padachinar was in the midst of it. But to say that it was just from Padachinar the recruitment took place, I think that's not entirely correct. It was from Balochistan, there were people from Punjab,
Yeah.
uh, and there were people from Karachi. And I'm not just saying this, without any evidence,
Mm.
because the Zenebune has published a copious book itself that actually pays tribute to martyrs.
Mm.
And within them, the biographies are specifically mentioned on what way these people were actually killed and what their affiliations were.
Okay.
And then we saw the Islamic State of Khorasan
Mm.
growing in Nangarhar, because Nangarhar is where they were, and it was felt and threatened, the peace because the Islamic State is extremely anti-Shia in its approach. The
Mm.
ideology is anti-Shia because Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was extremely anti-Shia, and he is the one who started the entire,
Mm.
sectarian violence in Iraq and Shia. So when they
Mm.
settled in Nangarhar, there were certain bombings that took place. And I
Mm.
remember claims coming in from, not, it wasn't ISKP, but it was ISKP affiliated media that actually said that it was retribution for the war in Iraq that would be now
Yeah.
served in this particular locality.
Mm.
Time went on, and FATA was merged into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
Yeah.
But the perennial issues still remained the same. Whereas the factions like the TTP, who initially were pretty much sectarian in their outlook, have drastically changed themselves. In 2018, the TTP published an entire, um, organogram and it is the new sort of thesis that they have come up with on how to actually gain public traction. And so it disassociates itself from sectarian violence, much to the like the Afghan Taliban and under their influence, who like to keep their relationship with Iran intact, as well as not go along into sectarian violence. So the support for, mostly in for militant organizations for Sunni areas had dwindled over the years. But the returnees that actually made it into Kurram have been creating a problem for the state in one way or another.
Mm.
And as I said, explained even that the five different factors were preceding one another. So one would sort of, catch fire, and then the other would catch fire, and then all five would come into play. And so, in order to address them, you had certain stakeholders that were there. What has
Mm.
actually happened post 2021, when the Afghan Taliban have taken over, the
Mm.
effect of that in Kuram is that there is a certain anxiety that is there, that we are being crushed in one way or another. But what it actually does is it's instigating those unaddressed issues of governance, particularly the land dispute,
Yeah.
that instigates this entire spectrum coming into play. And
Mm.
so what has happened is that because these land disputes, sitting somewhere in Lahore and Islamabad, we don't realize, but Fatah's land has not been sort of, distributed. Majority or part of it is Shamilat. What we call Shamilat is basically tribal land, which is owned equally by the tribe. And so there are claims over the land.
Okay.
Kurram is one of those areas where uh, during the British era, there was some land settlement in Padachinar that has taken place, even in some places in Lower Kurram as well. But somehow the displacement that took place
Mm.
because of military operations
Mm.
has instigated this, traditional marker of violence in this way, that those that have now returned to those areas are
Mm.
considered to be problems. And there are several villages that still will not accept the other sect.
Yeah, but if I might interject here briefly, um, so in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, for last 10.5 years almost, the government is held by PTI, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. And their flagship project when they first came to power was the digitization of the land records, or the clean governance of the land records, which your narrative of what you are telling us suggests that not much had happened in that count as well.
So it's interesting, and I really wanted that you ask this question.
Hmm.
Uh, the control of the state at this particular point is questionable in these areas, because
Hmm.
the land record and the land settlement and the digitization, there was
Hmm.
an entire commission that was formed for Kurram that actually has submitted its input to the government.
Okay.
From what I know in terms of the way that it happened was that when the first violence of land disputes erupted, and this entire narrative was created that it's just a land dispute. So
Hmm.
everybody said, why don't you resolve it? So there was a
Hmm.
land commission that was made, and Kurum was prioritized. And
Hmm.
despite about, I think it's been 16 months that the land commission has submitted its report to the KP government, it has not been able to implement it. Now, why it hasn't been able to implement it is because they fear that somebody or one of the sect would have to vacate their land and hand it over to another sect, which would actually stir more violence. So it is basically an analysis paralysis at this point, analyzing on what the outcome is going to be, that the government has not been able to establish its writ in the state, waiting in anticipation that there would be a good time where this could happen.
Oh,
But things are
the
becoming even worse
ages,
than.
yeah, ages old, the procrastination principle that if you just ignore the problem for a time, it will disappear, automatically vanish. But also, Iftikhar, that this, I understand some time in the past, it's also happened, a kind of a agreement was reached among the tribes with the intervention of the government. And there was this 1 year lease to, to a third party. Do you tell us about that?
Hasn't worked out. There is no, what has actually happened, the entire explanation of how these various vectors are coinciding in terms of conflict is that
Hmm.
the traditional architecture is totally damaged. So we had these, in within the Fatas, we had these tribal elders from both sects who were guarantors of peace. Now, what has happened is that because the international proxy conflict,
Hmm.
war analysis or impact has sort of obliterated the traditional decision making authority.
Hmm.
So, despite the fact that these tribal elders are called in right now, even for this ceasefire, they were called in, they haven't been able to guarantee the peace. We
Hmm.
still see violent attacks taking place, even despite the fact that there is a ceasefire. There were
Hmm.
two villages that were burnt last night, and they were like three deaths were confirmed, but we don't know actually what's happened because there is zero communication. They had to kill the internet, they had to kill the landline phones, and also sort of impose a semi curfew in the area so that there is no movement. The reason for that is also very interesting, and how these dynamics have sort of varied now is
Hmm.
that some of these killings have been instigated
Hmm.
by platforms such as TikTok and Facebook.
Hmm.
Is that there is material or sectarian material that's been put in
Hmm.
there. And the problem with it is that these are not people that are actually living in this area,
Hmm.
actually living somewhere either in the Middle East or either somewhere else.
Oh.
But since their roots are connected to this area, that
Hmm.
content sort of gathers traction. And for that reason, it sort of demands, some kind of action that people think that this, since the state is not acting, so we should actually go ahead and do it. So on the surface level, it might just be, it's very easy to say a severe reduction to say that, it's a
It's
land
just,
issue
yeah.
or it's just a sectarian part of it, but it's not. And it's even more complicated, Marvi. I mean, I remember the last time the government of Pakistan, gave a statement, we saw a reaction from the Iranian Foreign Office, a lengthy statement that was contradicting Pakistan's stance. And then the Foreign Office from Pakistan had to give a reaction to that.
Hmm.
And we've also seen that now that particular group, which is known as the Zainabiyun, has been banned by the government of Pakistan
Hmm.
in last few months. But we still see, that in social media is pretty much alive. That's because, and I'm not saying that only one sect is involved in it. That is in no way that I actually look at the conflict, because the instigators are from both sides. But
Yeah,
in
but
one way or another, the state has failed to actually say that it's the state.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
and the reason for that is very simple, because it's actually scared that the state would be made party to the conflict.
Yeah,
And
and
no and
yeah,
nobody in Pakistan actually wants to be caught between a sectarian conflict.
and let it happen, I also understand that these passenger vehicles, they have been routinely attacked on this road, and they are actually are escorted by the military caravans also. But the innocent civilians are still attacked and massacred so routinely. It happened 3 months ago. It happened in September 2023 near Charkhel, I believe.
Yeah.
Now again, uh, amidst and passengers are attacked when they are being escorted by the military caravan. So does that mean that the entire state apparatus has repeatedly failed to protect its citizens? Where are the state security forces in all of this?
I totally agree with you. I mean, when you actually go, I mean, I remember, and I'll give you an example from practical experience, because, um, I was standing on one of these hillsides, and I remember exactly in 2009. So there was
Hmm.
this military commander who had taken over the place from the Taliban back then. And the night when we stayed there to actually, for them to show us, they had taken it back.
Hmm.
So everybody in the room started criticizing him, and he took us on the hilltop, and he
Hmm.
looked at it and said that on TV it says a hilltop, but
Hmm.
when I cross and take a turn, it's Afghanistan,
Uh,
and and then when I move in a straight line back towards it, it's again Pakistan. So this geography is ridiculous in its own self as to
Yeah.
say how it can be controlled. But saying that there is no excuse and the amount of resources that are put in into the security apparatus, I think such issues should, you know, definitely be tackled. And I mean, that's more a very sort of a, optimistic view, but this problem, unless the situation, because some of it is internal to the area, some of it
Mm,
is more of a federal or national sort of a domain,
mm.
but part of a large chunk of it is not related to Pakistan.
I have a question, Iftikhar, and if it is too sensitive to answer, let me know and
Sure.
I'll edit it out. But I have to ask you this. In 2019, I interviewed a couple of locals. I didn't go to Parachinar, but I interviewed them while they were in Islamabad. And they were very upset on the security forces because they thought that not only the Haqqani network people were safely, they were provided safe haven there, but also the safe passage to Afghanistan from that area. And that was one reason why the Sunni militant, not the Sunni tribe, but the Sunni militants, uh, you know, exacerbated that conflict there. And Shia buses, the buses were routinely stopped there and people were taken out and there were, their shirts were removed to see if there were, those rituals,
Yeah,
Shia rituals with,
yeah,
they leave the,
yeah, yeah.
some
They leave the
wound,
marks on the
yeah,
body.
wound marks. So they were very upset and they said that whatever it was happening, it was happening because of the geopolitical situation. It suited the security establishment. What do you think about that?
I think in the older dynamics, yes.
Okay, but
Or in the
not now.
older time. No, not now. One of the problems of the entire situation in Kurram is that you don't see that kind of presence of the Afghan Taliban on the side of the border anymore.
Mhm.
Firstly, because Pakistan's relationship with the entire Afghan setup is pretty damned at this point. There is hardly any diplomatic relationship left.
Mm.
Secondly, whatever the objective in Afghanistan was to keep that part alive, that had been achieved after the US withdrawal. So that dynamic does not exist anymore. It's
Okay.
very blatant at this point. And that's
Mm.
why I said that this entire mosaic has changed. But
Mm.
our approach towards, as a state, to resolve that has not
Mm.
changed.
Has not
We're
changed.
using the same dynamics again and again, and thinking that repeated mistakes at some point would we'll get it correct, without changing our mentality in relation to it. At the crux of it, it is a governance issue, but there are so many additional layers to it that unless you resolve those, you will not be able to get to the governance part, and that's the failure that we are facing.
It's funny that, actually, it should not be funny. It's shameful. But it's so shameful that it becomes ridiculous. That
Also, Bobby, I'm sorry,
all
I'm,
this
I'm cutting
mess.
you out. I actually didn't answer your question in terms of the distrust with the security forces.
Yeah.
So there are two types of security forces that we talk about. One is the paramilitary FC, because they are traditionally the ones that should be deployed in Kuram.
Hmm.
And as part of FATA reforms, the active military wants to move out. So they have
Okay.
reduced their numbers considerably, handing it over to the FC. Now, the relationship of the FC with the locals
Hmm.
is not based on a lot of trust.
Hmm.
And that is why, even as a reaction to the killings this time, when we saw a protest, about 8 checkpoints between the FC and police were burned down by protesters. And if you remember very earlier on in 2015, when there were a
Hmm.
couple of bomb blasts that took place in Kurum, like large scale bomb blasts, I remember this one where an IED or a bomb was put into a fruit cart and then it
Yeah.
exploded.
Yes, they were massive. Yeah, I remember.
There was a huge issue back then, and then they went and surrounded the political agents' compound, and then there was firing, and there were more killings that took place, and then ultimately the army chief had to go down and give his word to them to end the protest. It's not
Mm,
very far back; it's just like 6, 7 years ago that all of this happened. So that, and one of the demands that traditionally has come in, and this has mostly come in from the Shia factions in Upper Kuram in Palachinar, that we will actually look after our own security.
mm.
And so that actually translates into a lot of distrust. So I think that citizen state relationship, that
That
need
has to be,
that
that
has
needs
to be
healing. Yeah.
that is ruptured and that needs to be healed in many ways.
And it's ridiculous that all this mess is made in the name of security, geopolitics, and everything, and then it is left on the civilians to sort it out and put it all on governance. I'm just hinting at the last speech that was made by the army chief, in which he
Mm.
said that it is because of the lack of governance or the shortcomings in the governance.
So, I
Uh,
mean, I think that at that level, to be very honest, I think that he would not want to go into the sectarian domain in that level. And my own belief is that by the time you reach the governance part, there has to be a lot of other work that needs to be done. Uh,
mm,
Unfortunately, it's a painstaking effort. And this has to do a lot with the larger dynamics on what's happening in the political domain in Pakistan as well. So it's not just, governance issues. I mean, we've got 50,000 people in Islamabad marching, and then there's firing, and then there's tear gas shells traveling
yeah.
160 kilometers. Pada
Mm,
Chinar was forgotten for a couple of days. It's just that that's the
absolutely.
news, and now we've gone back to
Yeah,
that.
it's
So
totally
it's the
forgotten.
overall scenario.
Mm,
But from a security standpoint, I'll also give you my analysis on what I think is that this within the larger scope of the conflict in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, uh,
mhm,
the south of KP is divided into three divisions,
mhm,
which is the Kohad division, and then there is the DI Khan division, and then there is the Banu division.
mm,
The Banu and DI Khan division at this point are like, from, if you look at post 2022,
mm.
69% of the attacks have taken place in the south of KP, but in these two divisions.
Okay.
So sum of total
Banu and
attacks in Pakistan has taken place in the south of KP.
mm,
It was only this third division, which is the Kohad division, that was at rest.
mhm,
And so, if you want to lit fire to this entire south of KP, which
mm,
fits in the larger agenda of conflict, because we've seen militant communications saying that they want to establish a quasi government within the south of KP.
mhm.
This exactly fits into that narrative as well.
Yeah. You know, how effective has this, is there this that 7-day ceasefire still in force, and how effective it is, and if it has failed, why? Because why I say fail is because we still are receiving reports of killings here and there, and bloodshed.
So I have viewed some documents in terms of what the Jirga decided. They were not part of the public record.
Okay.
But what I saw in there was that the agreement was that there'll be no firing unless another actor sort of pushes themselves or impedes its space into someone else's territory. This is what
Mm,
was said. Knowing that the traditional, consolidation mechanism that we had, or the what we now call as the alternate dispute resolution mechanism, the JIRGA,
mhm,
fancy terms for an old nomenclature, uh, that does not sort of gather much traction amongst the youthful population that has seen a different conflict. It's difficult that that ceasefire would remain intact for very long. Number one, unless the underlying issues are resolved. Uh,
mm,
but saying that also, one of the measures that they've adopted for a temporary period of time, I assume, is that they're
mm.
going to deploy a heavy contingent of security personnel on both sides of the road so that these convoys no longer get attacked. Uh,
What are the,
but
yeah,
but
yes.
the ceasefire, I mean, it's a ceasefire to say, maybe to control in some urban localities, as you might call it in the Fatas, there are hardly any urban spheres, but
Hmm.
in the more rural areas or in the more mountainous terrains, there are reports even as now as we speaking that there is intermittent firing that's going on.
Hmm. What are the three, this is my last question. What are the, do you think are the three tangible measures that the government can take, in short term, in medium term, and in long term to
I
put
think one of the
violence and,
the short term solution to all of it is that you have to show that the justice system is not just for one sect, it is for both sects.
yeah.
And so whatever crackdown there is, the state should impose its justice system.
Hmm.
Unless that happens, this killing for a killing will continue to go on.
Hmm.
The justice system in short term has to deliver to show that justice was done and now we guarantee peace. In the medium term, I think one of the most important things would be the land dispute settlements.
Hmm.
And in the long term part is that you need more roads and more of these people to actually get out of this area and travel to the rest of Pakistan, and even across out of Pakistan, to see that the world has moved on beyond sectarian violence and everything else.
Hmm.
There is a much larger worldview that exists than what is actually happening in that little nutshell at this point.
Yeah.
So I think that um, these people, they deserve that they should be seeing more of Pakistan. I mean, if they were living in Islamabad or Lahore in cultural hubs,
Hmm.
surely they would not be contributing to sectarian violence. They would be engaged in different activities.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
And see,
I think it's to open up the space a little more in the
yeah.
long-term solution.
And this is how societies evolve. I mean, if you,
Absolutely.
this is, I mean, it's a pity to even think that there's this area in Pakistan where the only way to reach the rest of Pakistan is one road, and that too is like, it's like jihad to travel on that road because you can or you cannot, come home safe. So it's a pity, and it's a double pity that Pakistan's security czar General Fez was deployed in Peshawar for for over
Yeah.
a year, I think
Yeah.
probably 2 years, as the corps commander, and even he could not uh, do it. I mean, he prides himself in resolving so many issues, but I think
He was there for a year
for a year.
because he was sent as a last resort. He had to spend a year as a corps commander. I remember that from history because he Imran would not let him go, so that he had to spend a
Yeah,
year to become an army chief.
yeah.
More inspired. That's why that year.
But
But
eventually could not
I,
touch
to
this
be
problem.
one last comment from me. I think that if the security establishment says that the government is responsible for these issues and the government says that it's a security problem,
Mm.
if this juggling keeps on taking place, I think there'll be no solution. Somebody needs to step forward and take responsibility at least of what's happening.
That's right. Absolutely. That's the crux of the matter. Take responsibility of what's happening. Don't leave the people in lurch, where they have no resort but to kill each other and get killed. Anyway,
Absolutely.
thank you very much, Iftikhar. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and it's a tragedy. It's tragic that we have to talk on this issue,
I
even
hope next time we are talking of something more fun.
something pleasant. Absolutely. So thank you, and thank you, viewers, for being with us. Please do subscribe our channel, and do share the video if you like it.
Thank you very much.